is an extremely timely topic, as we all know. It's also, to me, somewhat ironic since it's been perfect weather for the past 3 or 4 days, which is a little bit misleading. We are not experiencing perfect weather. We are not experiencing long-term perfect weather. And Dr. Linter is here to talk to us about the science behind it and how true the science is and how relevant the science is from a global perspective. And then he'll be talking to us, bringing it down to the local metro area here and the impact of climate in our area. So Dr. Linter is with George Mason University. He is the director of the Center of Ocean, Land, and Atmospheric Studies, or COLA, which conducts basic and applied climate research on climate predictability on a subseasonal and longer-term scale, focusing on phenomena such as monsoons, El Nino, and climate change. That's a mouthful, but he conducts research, and he's really doing it both micro and macro, and which is extremely relevant. He just finished a 4-year stint as the chair of the Department of Atmospheric, Oceanic, and Earth Sciences at George Mason. He's got a lot of background before that. He taught at the University of Maryland and was with NASA for a little while earlier in his career. So we are extremely lucky to have Dr. Kinter here talking to us about this, and particularly about how it focuses here. I did want to remind you that the Q&A that Terry just talked about, we will be holding that to the end. So if you have a burning issue that's relevant to what Dr. Kinter is talking about, I'll be monitoring for that, but generally we'd like to hold the questions to the end. Jim, there you go. Please tell us about climate.
Oh, thank you so much, Louise. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and the Encore Learning Group. Let me get my screen up here for you so that you can see what I would like you to see. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing a slide with some pictures on it and my title. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, great. Well, like I said, it's a great pleasure to be here today. Even though the topic is a sobering one, I'm going to try to give you essentially the contents of a semester-long course that we have at George Mason. It's called Climate 101. And in just 1 hour, or a little bit less than that. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind. And as I mentioned, it's a sobering topic. So I'm hoping that it's not terribly depressing for everyone, but there will be a message of hope at the end of the talk. So what I'm going to talk about is climate change in Virginia, the reality, the inevitable, and hope for the future. And I'm going to start with this quote from a New York Times columnist, Maureen Dowd. This was from an op-ed column she had in the paper in late July. She says, "It's Mad Max apocalyptic. Crazy storms that used to hit every century now seem quotidian, overwhelming systems that cannot withstand such a battering." So I highlighted a couple of the SAT words in that sentence: apocalyptic, which means resembling the end of the world, or momentous or catastrophic, and quotidian, which is just the opposite of that. It's ordinary or everyday, something we get used to. And so we've been using this phrase, the new normal, to think about how climate change is affecting us in our day-to-day lives. Well, here's what we might mean by apocalyptic. This was an event from just just about a month ago, actually. There was a rain event in Western Tennessee that dropped 17 inches of rain in 1 day. Actually, more than 9 inches of that fell in just a 3-hour period. And you can imagine what happens when that amount of water comes down out of the sky in that short a period of time. We get pictures like this in the newspaper, with houses displaced from their foundations and their basements full of water, houses that were lifted up by water and dropped on automobiles, trees down, power, of course, out over most of the state. Truly what we might think of as an apocalyptic event. Here's another picture that you see in the newspaper a lot these days. The apocalyptic events that are happening in the Western United States. This is a picture from the Dixie Fire in California, taken again about a month ago. This fire has consumed over 1,500 square miles of forest. It's destroyed over 1,200 buildings. So we've been thinking about this problem of climate change for quite a while now. And in particular, this also happened within the past month or so. This was the release of the 6th in a series of periodic assessment reports that are produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, this is essentially the authoritative review of the current state of the science of climate change. It happens every 5 to 6 years. It was begun in 1990 as a result of a UN conference held in Rio de Janeiro, and it's been coming out periodically ever since. This is the 6th such report, and I put some numbers down here. This is a report that was generated by over 200 scientists from 65 different countries. They did a monumental task of reviewing 14,000 peer-reviewed publications that had appeared in the intervening 5 to 6 years since the previous report. And I want to emphasize 2 things about this report. One is it's intergovernmental, which means it's a very conservative report. 195 countries had to approve essentially every word in this 4,000-page document. And so there's very little room for disagreement and very little room for outrageous statements. This is a very conservative document. Well, here are some of the messages that were confirmed in this 6th report of the IPCC. First, climate is changing faster than at any time in the past 2 million years. And if we look into the future, it's virtually unavoidable for the global average temperature to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And I'll explain what all of these, why 1.5 centigrade is of interest and pre-industrial in 2050. I'll explain what all of this means in a few minutes. Second big message is that humans who burn fossil fuel are primarily responsible for this very rapid climate change. And of course, who are those humans who burn fossil fuels? All of us. If we're using coal to heat our homes, or oil, or natural gas, if we're turning on a light bulb, which is powered by an electric power company, those power companies are burning coal to generate that electricity. So all of us are fossil fuel burning humans, and therefore all of us are primarily responsible for this very rapid climate change. The third big message is that the consequences are serious and the impacts are largely negative. We might imagine that winter storms will not be as big a deal in the future because of global warming, but by and large, all of the other impacts are negative impacts that are going to be costly, affecting human lives, affecting property, and affecting ecosystems. And looking again into the future, if no changes are made to the rate at which humans are emitting carbon into the atmosphere, the Earth will not warm by 1.5 degrees, but it will warm by more than 2.5 degrees centigrade, which is widely viewed as a dangerous level of warming, not only for humans, but also for species extinctions. And it's possible that the Earth would warm by as much as 3 to 5 degrees centigrade, possibly even by the end of this century, by the year 2100. And that would be truly catastrophic or apocalyptic, to use Maureen Dowd's word. Now, a message that's not in this report, because this report focuses only on the science, but a message that will come out in the 2nd volume or the 3rd volume of this IPCC assessment, is that there is hope. Even though it's a very depressing message in general, we do have the technology to defeat the climate change problem. We can win in this very important struggle, but it requires bold, aggressive action, and it has to happen this decade. We have to get started. We have been delaying our attention to this problem. We have been delaying taking action. And if we want to avoid even more dangerous conditions in the latter half of the 21st century, we've got to start today. So let's take each of these messages and tear it apart a bit so that you get a better feeling for what we're talking about. Climate is changing very fast, and humans are responsible. So here in a single slide is how the Earth's climate system operates. The Earth's climate system attempts to achieve an energy equilibrium. What that means is that we receive energy from the sun and we emit energy back into space. And all other things being equal, if there were an equilibrium state, then the amount of energy that we emit back into space would be equal to the amount of energy that we receive from the sun. That's the nature of an equilibrium. And we know that part of that equilibrium process is the absorption and re-emission of energy that happens in the atmosphere. So if the Earth had no atmosphere, without what we call the greenhouse effect, then the Earth's temperature on average over the whole year and over the whole surface of the Earth would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the freezing point of water. The planet would be an ice ball. But fortunately for us, our atmosphere contains these trace amounts of what we call greenhouse gases. These are gases that are capable of absorbing and re-emitting energy in the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And basically what this means is that these gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and sulfur hexafluoride, are actually acting like a blanket. They are absorbing energy that's being emitted from the Earth's surface, and they're re-emitting it back to the Earth to warm it up even more. So that energy that's being generated by the sun is actually reused. And with the greenhouse effect, our planet is not 0 degrees Fahrenheit, it's 59 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the average over the whole globe and over a whole year. So 59 Fahrenheit, of course, is quite balmy, and it makes it possible for water to exist in all 3 phases, gas, liquid, and solid phases here on Earth. And that's very important for life and very important for many other things as well. So what's happening that humans are changing the equilibrium? So this is a chart. It takes a minute to absorb what we're doing here with this chart. But this is, I'm going to show you several charts like this so you can get a feeling for the data that we use in our climate research. This is a time series chart, which means running along the x-axis, or from left to right, is time. So we start back in the year 1750, the middle of the 18th century, and we run through time until the present. And this 0 line in the middle of the chart represents that equilibrium I mentioned, that energy equilibrium. And as these lines that go up and down from the 0 are showing us, these are ways in which our energy equilibrium is being disrupted. So on the plus side, making our energy equilibrium warmer are things like carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, concentration of other greenhouse gases like methane and ozone. And then on the minus side, things that are that are trying to push us away from equilibrium to the colder side are things like aerosols. These are microscopic particles that exist in the atmosphere. And I'm not talking about spray cans like shaving cream and hairspray. These are microscopic particles such as come out of volcanoes or that come out of industrial processes. And so aerosols are actually having a negative effect on the energy equilibrium, as is land use. So land use primarily having to do with changing the surface albedo, which is how much energy is reflected back into space. So the net result of all of that is this black curve that you see going up and down, and then over the last half a century or so, it's always positive. That's because the effect of carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases is overwhelming these negative effects. You'll notice that the black line has these sort of punctuated downturns, and I've labeled each of them with a funny name. These are the names of volcanoes. So as it turns out, that very violent volcanoes like Krakatoa in the 19th century, and these 3 late 20th century volcanic eruptions in Agung, El Chichon, and Pinatubo. This is in Central America, and this is in Indonesia. These volcanoes can actually perturb the Earth's energy balance to the negative side because they put so much dust and aerosol into the atmosphere that they act like a parasol and cool the Earth's surface. But the net effect overall, as you can see from this black line, is that we've pushed the energy budget of the Earth has been pushed to the positive side, a positive imbalance, disequilibrium. And the result is primarily because of carbon dioxide that's present in the atmosphere. Now, I wanted to point out 2 things about this chart. First, it comes from this climate science special report that came from the US government during the Trump administration. So I'm making that point because just like the IPCC report has to be approved by 195 countries, and so it's a very conservative report. Likewise, this US government report came out during the Trump administration, And as you know, the Trump administration was a very conservative administration. And so this report is taking a very conservative view of the facts that are available. So the net result here at the very end of this time series is that about 2 watts per square meter of imbalance has been imposed on the Earth's equilibrium climate, pushing it to the positive side of disequilibrium. What is 2 watts? 2 watts sounds like a very small number, but the point is it's 2 watts for every square meter, or about every 10 square feet on the Earth's surface. And of course, the Earth is really, really big. So the number of square meters is a really, really big number. And when we multiply that 2 watts per square meter by the number of square meters on the Earth's surface, it's 1,000,000 billion watts, 1,000,000 gigawatts for the Earth as a whole. That's equivalent to about 40,000 Three Gorges dams. It's equivalent, if you remember the movie Back to the Future, where the crazy scientist talked about lightning bolts producing gigawatts of energy. So it's about 100,000 Back to the Future lightning bolts worth. My favorite way of thinking about it, because it's very relatable, is that 2 watts per square meter is the same as putting a 60-watt light bulb above every 20 by 20 foot patch of the Earth over the entire planet. You can imagine what that's doing to the surface in terms of warming things up. Now, where does all that carbon dioxide come from? Well, here again is another time series. This one only goes back to 1850 because our data is only really valid back to the middle of the 19th century. But again, you can see a 0 line here in the middle, and above this line are what we call sources of carbon dioxide, basically carbon dioxide that's being added to the system. And below the 0 line are sinks, carbon dioxide that's being taken out of the system. And on the plus side, you see these 2 big items. One is fossil fuel combustion, which has been growing and then growing even more rapidly since the middle of the 20th century. And also land use change. This is basically deforestation, is creating carbon dioxide flux into the atmosphere. And then here are the sinks. So the big one is the atmosphere. The atmosphere receives about a half and keeps about a half of the total emitted carbon dioxide. And then land and ocean are splitting the other half. This ocean absorption is also quite serious. We're not going to talk about it anymore after this slide. But ocean absorption is carbon dioxide being absorbed by the world's ocean. What happens when water absorbs carbon dioxide is it forms a solution of carbonic acid. So the ocean is becoming more and more acidic over time. Today, the ocean is basic, meaning it is more alkaline than it is acid. But over time, the pH of the ocean is going down, which means the acid concentration or the hydrogen ion concentration is increasing with time. And that has serious implications for the ecosystems in the ocean, particularly the very small critters who have to make a shell out of calcium carbonate. So where does that CO2, so we see this big gray curve getting very big, very fast and reaching about 11 billion tons of carbon or 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. Where does that come from? Well, if you look at the right-hand diagram, you see that coal is king. Worldwide, coal represents about a third of that 11 billion metric tons of carbon that's emitted every year over the whole globe. And then if you break it down by country, you see the big winner, the big contributor to all of this is China, which is only true for the past 20 years. If you go back 20 years, it was the United States that was the largest emitter worldwide. China took over that position in about 2005, and it's been growing very rapidly since then. Sorry about that. So the China's contribution to the global emissions is about 25% of the total at this point. And back before 2000, the United States was responsible for about 25%. Today, the United States represents about 15% of the total. So as we think about this disequilibrium, pushing the energy away from equilibrium in the positive direction, the net effect is to warm up the planet. So here's yet another time series for you to look at. This again, going back to the middle, actually the later part of the 19th century and coming up to the present. This is the temperature. We average over the whole globe and we average over the whole year to come up with this number. And you can see that since the latter part of the 19th century and through the whole 20th century, it's been essentially rising. There's some ups and downs along the way, but on average, it has been almost inexorably increasing. And if you look at, so that the total amount of warming since pre-industrial times, since back before this chart, is between 1.1 and 1.2 degrees centigrade, or about 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's the way that this chart lays out over the whole globe, and you can see that the land surfaces are warming up faster than the oceans. And what you can't tell from this, because of the data hasn't been presented properly, but what you can see here is that, or what you could see if you had the data, is that the poles are actually warming up about twice as fast as the global average. So what is this 1.1 to 1.2 degrees centigrade or 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit? What's the big deal? It doesn't sound like a very big thing. And the way I'd like you to think about it is to think of this global average annual average surface temperature as an index of global warming. And you're familiar with indices, you use them all the time. For example, you hear about the Standard & Poor's 500 as a measure of US commercial activity. So what do we mean by an index? Well, it's derived from a series of computations that process and average a lot of data. This S&P 500 includes data from 500 different US companies. It's a single yardstick to quantify a very complex process. Obviously, the economy is a very complex set of interactions and markets and so on, as well as regulations. And it's reported in familiar units. You might be tempted to think of this number as a number of dollars if you bought a basket of these 500 stocks. Well, similarly, you might be tempted to think of this as a temperature that you can relate to. But of course, since I started talking, it's entirely possible that the temperature outside your window has changed by 1 degree centigrade. So this doesn't seem like a very big number. The reality is that it is a very big number. And when we look at one more time series, now this one goes back not 100 years or 200 years, it goes back 2,000 years. And we do this by reconstructing the climate over the past 2,000 years using what are called paleo records or paleoclimate records, things like tree rings and ice cores. Bottom line is that we can make a reasonably confident estimate of what the global average surface temperature was all the way back to the year 1, the time of Jesus Christ. And over that period of time, you can see that from this chart that the global average surface temperature has varied up and down between about minus 0.5 and plus 0.5 degrees centigrade. In the early part of this 2,000 years, it was slightly above some reference level. And then in the middle part of the 1600s and 1700s, we had what we call the medieval, the cold period in that part of the, and you see a lot of European literature refers to how cold things are and ice skating in Amsterdam and so on. And then you see in this last part of the record from about 1850 forward, when we have direct observations of the temperature, and suddenly we're shooting up out of this 0.5 to minus 0.5 range and getting up above 1 degree centigrade. So it's really the rapidity of this change which is remarkable. Now, how do we know that it's humans? Well, first of all, you have to ask the question, how do we know that it's the greenhouse gases, the carbon dioxide? And the answer is that we've been observing changes in the way the atmosphere behaves and the climate system behaves for decades, making direct measurements, and including the last 4 or 5 decades, we've been making measurements from space. And these are all characteristics of the Earth's climate that we've observed over the past 50 to 100 years. We notice that the nights are warming faster than the days. We notice that the stratosphere is cooling. From satellite, we can measure less heat is escaping into space. Well, from all of these characteristics, the ones I've labeled GHG are only attributable to increasing greenhouse gas concentrations like carbon dioxide and methane. For example, nights warming faster than days. That can't happen because the sun is suddenly producing more energy or anything like that. It can only happen because there's more gas, carbon dioxide and methane, present in the atmosphere to absorb and re-emit energy at night. If we look at some of these other factors, these are the ones that tell us that we know it's humans. We find more fossil fuel carbon, meaning carbon that comes from petroleum, and coal. We find more of that in the air. We find more of that in coral. As we drill down into coral, we find that there's more fossil fuel carbon present now than there was in the past. There's less oxygen in the air. We shouldn't worry about this. There's plenty of oxygen. These are minuscule changes in oxygen, but they're big enough for us to measure. And the only reason why oxygen should be going down over time is because there's combustion happening. We're oxidizing the carbon in the coal to produce CO2, and that takes oxygen out of the atmosphere. And here's what, in my circles, in the world's climate modeling world, we sort of call this chart the smoking gun, because what you see here is another time series, now from 1850 to the present, but with two curves on it, not just one curve. The black curve here is the observed global average surface temperature, and the brown cloud that you see around it are simulations that we have made of the Earth's climate using sophisticated models of the climate. These are computer simulations of the Earth's climate. And we're able to essentially nail the whole record of the Earth's climate variability for the past couple of 100 years within a very high degree of precision and accuracy. And this brown cloud here is actually our measure of our confidence in this brown curve that you see here. Well, what's the blue curve? Well, the blue curve is another set of climate simulations identical to what we did for the brown curve, except for one thing. We took humans out of the Earth. So that's something you can do in a computer. You can run your Earth simulation with and without humans. When we take humans out of the equation, we get the blue curve. And you can see that, again, the planet's climate just varies between this plus or minus 0.5, actually in the more recent times between plus or minus 0.3 degrees centigrade over the whole record. And so where the brown area and the blue area have separated in the later part of the 20th century, that's when we became very confident that humans are responsible for this rapid increase in the global average temperature. So let's talk about what that means in terms of real consequences. And as I said, the third big message of this talk and of the IPCC report is that the consequences are serious and the impacts are largely negative. Well, this IPCC report, as I said, came out about a month and a half ago, and the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, was quoted as saying, this report is a code red for humanity. Later on, as another report that came out, the so-called NDC report, which I won't talk about, but it's another report coming from the same group from the United Nations, says that the planet is on a catastrophic pathway. There's that catastrophic word again. We might even say apocalyptic. Well, here's some evidence that things are getting out of hand. July was Earth's hottest month on record. And it wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just, oh, just this past July, things got out of hand. The previous year, August was the hottest month on record in 2020. And you go back into 2019, and again, July was the hottest until then, and so on and so on and so on. As you go back for the last 2 or 3 decades, you find that we're breaking the Earth's hottest month record almost every year. The global average temperature in July this year was 1.67 or about 1.67 Fahrenheit or about 1 degree centigrade above the 20th century average. So again, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that when that global average temperature goes up, the extreme temperatures go up with it. And so here is just showing you one summer, one Northern Hemisphere summer in 2018. And you're seeing each day of the year going by. And wherever you see a red dot, that's a place where the daily record high for that date was broken. Where you see a brown dot, that's where the monthly record high for that date was broken. And where you see a black dot, you see those every so often, the all-time record high was broken. So this is what's going on. We know that people can get accustomed to a broad range of temperatures, but when temperature breaks the daily high record, it's annoying. And some people who are immune system compromised get sick. And when the monthly record is broken, or when the all-time record high is broken, heat illness becomes prevalent. And we saw this recently in the Pacific Northwest when they had a heat wave of 120 degrees or more Fahrenheit, and hundreds of people died. Well, the IPCC projects this into the future. And according to this report, which, as I said, is a very conservative report and has a high degree of confidence, when we look back at this period from 1850 to 1900 and calculate for every point on the globe, what was the warmest temperature recorded over that entire 50 years, what we might call the 50-year heat event of that period. And now we look at how often we get that same temperature in various places around the world. We find that now the 50-year event is about 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the 50-year event back in the 19th century. And now, instead of happening every 50 years, it happens every 10 years. So I'm calling this the new extreme. It's higher and it's more frequent. If we project forward to about the middle of this century, when we will reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than pre-industrial, then that 50-year event becomes 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in the 19th century, and it happens every 6 years. I'm viewing this as an inevitable situation, so I call that the inevitable extreme. Now, if we project out to the end of this century, when we could reach 2 degrees centigrade on a conservative pathway, or 4 degrees centigrade on a business as usual with no regulation of carbon emissions, the temperature for the 50-year event could be 5 or almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in the 19th century. And instead of happening every 50 years, it'll happen almost every year. And I call that the future normal with a question mark, because it isn't a foregone conclusion that we will get to this stage. But this is what would happen in a situation where we don't regulate our behavior. You've seen pictures like this. I showed you one at the beginning of the lecture. The Western US going up in flames. This was last year, in 2020. This was in a town called Oroville, California. I asked this question, is it apocalyptic or quotidian? Well, let's see. By the way, we see the same thing happening. Sorry, I clicked too much. This is New South Wales, Australia. And again, in their summertime last year, they had the same thing, apocalyptic pictures, but now, unlike ours, they have kangaroos in the foreground. Again, is it apocalyptic or quotidian? Well, to find out if it's going to become the new normal, or if it's going to become a normal event, we can look here. So 2021 is already shaping up to top 2020. This is this isn't the most recent map, but it's one I pulled down a week or two ago from the Drought Monitor, which is a U.S. It's a collaborative project of several universities and the U.S. government to produce a map of drought in the United States. And you see this big swath of brown here, which is exceptional drought, and this even bigger swath of red throughout the northern tier and most of the Western United States. This is extreme drought. So we're seeing that 2021 is in many ways even worse than 2020. And so yet again, the Western US is going up in flames. Here's the Bootleg Fire from Oregon, the Dixie Fire from California. Here's the percentage change by climate zone of fire weather days. So this fire weather days is simply a day in which the potential for forest fires is high because it's dry and it's hot and the wind is blowing. And so you see 200% increase in the Central Valley of California in fire weather days in this period from 1973 to the 2020. And likewise, throughout most of the Western United States, more than 100% increases in the number of fire weather days over that period. The Southwest is also facing a serious problem with water availability. Here's a time series going back just to 1935. This was the year that the Hoover Dam was constructed and came online. And what you're seeing plotted here is the total volume of water in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So here is Lake Mead filling up over this period in the late 1930s and then reaching its normal level, about 20 million acre feet of water. And then here's the Glen Canyon Dam being erected and slowly filling up the Lake Powell so that it reaches its equilibrium value of about 40, the sum together with Lake Mead and Lake Powell, about 40 million acre feet. And then you see it fluctuating up and down for a couple of decades. And then beginning in 1995, you see this downward turn. And really the drought that's been experienced in the Western United States started back here in the mid 1990s, and it has continued through the present. So that just recently, a water emergency was declared. Now, this planning for water availability in the West, including the building of the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams, was done in the 1930s, when it turns out there was unusually abundant rainfall happening in the Western United States. And of course, things haven't gone that way since then. So there's been a drought, and global warming is exacerbating that by increasing the evaporation and the evapotranspiration, which is how plants exchange water with the atmosphere. So the result is this water emergency was declared last month. Colorado River is now in shortage, and they have imposed mandatory cuts in how much water people can withdraw. You see this picture of Lake Mead? That's that little blue speck in the far distance. It used to come all the way up to this roadway here, which is near Boulder City, Nevada. And here on the right, you see Lake Powell. Up here's the water level of just a few decades ago, and here's where the water is today. So again, we ask this question, is it apocalyptic or is it quotidian? Well, it looks apocalyptic, but it may become the new normal in the Western United States. And here's, if we look in our crystal ball and really in our climate simulations and see how things are going to be in the future. Here's the soil moisture. This is a map of soil moisture. In the case where we think about the Earth being 1.5 degrees warmer than it was in pre-industrial times. And you see this pattern with dry. Dry is below normal with brown colors and above normal or green colors. You see dry soil moistures throughout the West, and particularly through the Great Plains of the United States and Canada. You see extreme drying in northern South America and Central America and the Caribbean and around the Mediterranean, as well as in parts of China and Siberia. If we get to the point where the planet has warmed by 4 degrees, which, as I said, is a possibility if there's no regulation of carbon emissions in the future, well, then you see everything going basically off the scale with dark browns, meaning more than 1.5 standard deviations below normal of the soil moisture throughout northern South America. We'll see the tropical rainforests dying under these sorts of soil moisture conditions. Same thing in Central America. We'll see prolonged, unmanageable droughts in the Western United States. We will see all of the wine producing areas around the Mediterranean no longer able to support grapes. And those sorts of changes are literally cataclysmic for the world economy and for all these ecosystems. And it's not just the heat or the drying of the surface of the soil moisture, it's the humidity as well. With global warming, ironically, it gets warmer and the atmosphere is able to hold more water vapor. And we measure those two effects, the heat and the water vapor content, in a quantity we call the wet bulb temperature, which is kind of an esoteric metric. But the bottom line is that when the wet bulb temperature exceeds 35 C, or about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, humans can no longer survive. This makes it so that humans can't cool their bodies, their core temperature rises, and their organs fail. And this is a map showing you the historical level of wet bulb temperatures in India and Bangladesh. And you see northern India and into Bangladesh, you see this swath where the temperatures are getting into the low 30s on the centigrade scale of this wet bulb temperature. So not reaching human mortality stages, but certainly very, very uncomfortable and potentially causing illness. Well, here are two future scenarios. This is sort of a moderate scenario in the middle. The one on the right is the one I've been calling the unregulated future, where we allow the Earth's temperature to just keep going up because we're emitting more and more carbon dioxide as worldwide. And you see many places in northern India and in western Bangladesh where the temperature is now exceeding, this wet bulb temperature is now exceeding 35 C and making these parts of the world essentially uninhabitable. If we bring this closer to home in terms of what heat and humidity do to humans in the United States, well, here's the death per million per year. So we're dividing by the number of millions of people in each one of these states and counting up how many people die as a result of heat stroke. And you see very large numbers in places where there's not a lot of people, because we're dividing by a small number, we get a big ratio. But this is fewer than 100, and here in the southern states where they're acclimated to high temperatures, fewer than 30 people dying per million per year. So nobody's death is pleasant, but certainly these numbers don't alarm. But if we go to this no emissions reduction or no regulation environment on the left here, we see places like Montana and most of the northern tier getting up above 100, 300, 500, even places with more than 700 deaths per million per year to heat stroke because of both the combined effects of heat and humidity. So another maybe ironic, maybe expected part of this global warming thing is that we expect extreme rainfall to increase in the future. Here's again from this Trump administration report showing you how much extreme rainfall has increased. In the northeastern United States, it's increased by almost 100%. And here in the southeast, which Virginia is a part of, is 49% increase in extreme rainfall events. You see things like this. This is Hurricane Laura. It's the strongest hurricane ever to make landfall in Louisiana. That was last year. And of course, this year we had Hurricane Ida that swamped New Orleans yet again. We also see these sorts of consequences, which in retrospect are kind of obvious, but we're measuring them and we're alarmed by the quantitative nature of these changes. If you warm things up, there's going to be less ice because ice demands a cold environment. So we're seeing glaciers disappear. If you haven't been to Glacier National Park, you should go as soon as you can because there won't be a glacier there by the end of this decade. Ice that's floating in the ocean is disappearing. Here's the Bering Sea, should be full of ice at this time of year. This would be in springtime, but in the spring of 2019, there wasn't any ice in the Bering Strait. And similarly, the ice that's flowing out of Greenland and Antarctica, this happens to be a schematic diagram of the Antarctic ice sheet. This ice is also melting. And as this ice melts, and as the glacier ice melts, what happens is the ice melts and flows into the ocean so that sea level rises. Well, when sea level rises, we get pictures like this. This is a tiny island, Kiribati, in the Western tropical Pacific Ocean, is becoming uninhabitable because this is not a tropical cyclone or a hurricane that came through. There's no typhoon that did this. This is simply the daily high tide in this particular village. It's called Ayata and Tarawa Kiribati. So this island is becoming uninhabitable, and many other islands that are basically coral atolls are all disappearing as a result of sea level rise. And there might be some gotchas that we don't even necessarily know everything we need to know about. So for example, there's a lot of methane that's tied up in what are called permafrost hydrates in the high latitudes, like in Alaska and northern Canada. And methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So if this methane becomes freed by global warming as the permafrost melts, we see much more of a greenhouse effect from just this relatively small releases of methane. We've been measuring this for just a couple of decades, and we've seen a quadrupling of the amount of methane released by the permafrost just over this one decade, or less than a decade, from 2006 to 2013. I wasn't able to get more recent numbers on this. And also, Antarctica is really two continents in one. There's East Antarctica, which is a very thick sheet of ice that's very well bound to the continent and unlikely to melt anytime soon. It will take hundreds or maybe 1,000 years for this ice to melt. But West Antarctica, in contrast, is two big sheets of ice that are flowing out through the Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea on these big ice shelves. And also it has a peninsula here, which has ice that's very precariously perched on some rocks that extend out into the Southern Ocean. Well, if the West Antarctic ice sheet were to become unstable, as we suspect it may be becoming, that would result in a total sea level rise of 4.8 meters or 16 feet. So of course, that would be something to be alarmed about. If we look into the future and think about what humans are going to do, well, one thing humans have been doing quite regularly for thousands of years is growing their population, growing our population. When I was born, the planet had about 3 billion people, and since then it's more than doubled, and we expect it to reach 8 billion before the end of this year. And if we think about just since the first IPCC report, which came out in 1990, the global population has increased by 50%. In the United States, the population has increased by 1/3. In China, it's increased by 1/4. The global emissions of carbon dioxide have increased by 75%. And so the per capita, if we divide emissions by people, per capita emissions have increased by 20%. And that's not happening in the United States. The United States, we're actually getting more capable of conserving and making alternative choices for renewable energy, so that we've reduced our carbon emissions per capita by about 9%. But China is on a trajectory to modernize, to become industrial, and to raise the standard of living for its billions of people. So the 30-year trends are population is increasing exponentially, carbon dioxide emission is increasing even faster, and the developing countries, including China, are improving their standard of living by consuming more energy. So the result is this. We're looking now at global carbon dioxide emissions, going back just to the first IPCC report of 1990. And then here's the present, this blue vertical line. And then here are future scenarios. So one future scenario would be if everybody, all the countries of the world, keep the promises they made in 2015 at what was called the Paris Climate Conference, when they agreed to limit their emissions in the future. That would put us on this blue, this horizontal trajectory. If there's no regulation, if everybody keeps growing their economies and growing their energy consumption, we would be on this trajectory, reaching doubling of the total amount of carbon dioxide emission by about 2070. The third trajectory here is this downward trend. If we not only keep our promises made in Paris, but take a more aggressive action to limit our emissions, then we would be on this trajectory and reach nearly zero emissions by the end of the century, or even possibly in some scenarios, negative emissions, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Well, the problem here is that even on this horizontal trajectory, if everybody keeps their promises and holds their emissions steady so that we only have 40 billion tons added every year, we only have an 8% chance of keeping the planet from warming up by more than 2 degrees. And there's no way to prevent 1.5 degrees centigrade warming. If we're on this no policy trajectory, then we have a better than 50% chance of warming up by more than 4 degrees centigrade, as I showed you before, catastrophic levels of climate change. So the trajectory we need to be on is this one, the one that goes down. And in order to do that, we need increased ambition, both nationally and globally, for how we reduce our carbon emissions. I'm going to skip that one. So if we think about this high scenario, the business as usual, or growing everybody's economy as much as possible, by just mid-century, there would be 40 to 50 more days here in Virginia that have average temperatures above 90 Fahrenheit. If you look out at Yuma County, Arizona, we increased the number of days from 103 to 130 some of more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically, the whole summer is above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the daily high temperature, and nearly the whole year is above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Flash flooding. Well, this everybody in our area is very familiar with. Here's the story from last year, flooding in Loudoun County near Leesburg, where they got 5 inches of rain in a period of about 36 hours. Here's a backyard in Alexandria from last summer. Again, more than 2 inches of rain in one day. It was the 4th time in 2020 that Alexandria got more than 2 inches of rain in one day. Here's Culpeper, Virginia, where they got 9.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. Most of it fell with just 6 hours, producing this type of picture in the newspapers. Here's very recently, just this year in August, where we had 4.5 inches of rain in less than 1 hour here in Alexandria. And so again, flooding basements, street closures, power outages, trees down. And then again, on the 20th of August, 2.5 inches here, 2.8 inches in the district. This is what it looks like when you get that much rain in a short period of time in the wrong place. This is Ellicott City, Maryland. This happened to be my birthday 3 years ago. And this was the second time in just 2 years that they had what they think of as a 1,000-year flood. And of course, it wiped out the downtown of Ellicott City, which is very slowly rebuilding today. In terms of sea level, so this is not flash flooding, but just the water inexorably rising over time. Global average sea level has already risen by quite a bit. And if we look at our worst case scenario, our business as usual, or no regulation scenario, if emissions continue to grow for 80 more years, and this is a big if, but if the ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica become unstable, then we would expect the global average sea level to be 6 feet higher in 2100 than it was in 1900. Well, here's what 6 feet looks like. In Florida, it means the Keys are underwater. It means Miami Beach is underwater. It means much of metropolitan Miami is underwater. Much of Fort Lauderdale is underwater. The Everglades is no longer a river of grass. It's now an ocean. And if we look closer to home, no more vacationing in the Outer Banks. Much of coastal Carolina becomes underwater. And Norfolk, Virginia Beach, and Hampton Roads area all suffer flooding. We get events like this. This happened in Norfolk a couple of years ago where there was beautiful sunny day, no tropical storm, no rains, no flash flooding, but the water came up to the tires of the cars because the storm drains were no longer able to keep the tide out. And studying this, we find this was a NOAA study of a couple of years ago. About 850 homes in Hampton Roads could be underwater as early as 2030. Underwater in the sense that uninhabitable. And here was a report from NOAA. The same report mentions that today's flood in Norfolk that happens maybe once a year, a couple times a year, will become the daily high tide by 2060. And this is not in any scenario. This is just looking at the way things are going now. Norfolk has this problem. It's got a double whammy. So the ocean is rising both because it's warming up and taking up more volume, and because the ice on land is melting and flowing into the oceans. But in Norfolk, we also have the land is subsiding. It's subsiding because of a post-ice age rebound, and also because we're withdrawing groundwater and making the sediment compact. So the result of the two things are going in the same direction in a relative sense. And we've seen 20 inches of sea level rise in the mouth of the Chesapeake just in the past 90 years. And with another 80 years on, we could see 20 to 40 more inches of rise. Last of our consequences has to do with public health. So vector-borne diseases are loving global warming. Thinking about ticks, deer ticks. This is reports of Lyme disease in 1996. This is reports of Lyme disease in 2019. You see the overwhelming expansion of Lyme disease. This is because it's no longer cold enough in the winter to cut back on the tick population. They're able to winter over in large numbers. And so they're spreading Lyme disease more than ever. And here, I'm sorry for showing you a horrible picture of a mosquito taking a blood meal from a human. I think this is somebody's arm. But the problem with mosquitoes is they also carry disease. And in our area, that means West Nile virus. So we've seen over 3,000 cumulative reports of West Nile virus, which didn't exist before 1999 in this area. And as a reminder, 80% are asymptomatic. So this 3,300 reports is out of some 30,000 people who were probably infected with West Nile. So the problem with climate change then is what Daniel Kahneman, the famous author of Thinking Fast and Slow, he calls it a perfect problem. It's remote. It happens to people who are far away from us, much more so than it happens to us. It doesn't happen in a single place. It's everywhere. It's slow. It's happening very gradually. You have this analog of a frog in a pot of water that's slowly boiling to death. It's painful. We have to make sacrifices today. We have to cut back on our energy usage in order to avoid uncertain losses in the future. It's complex. There's no single cause. We can't do one thing and solve global warming. We have to do all of the above. And it's universal. There's no single enemy. We can't send the Marines to solve this problem. And finally, it's controversial because its effects are contested, although less and less so over time as we get more and more confident about what really is happening. And there are disagreements about what to do because there are people and companies that have an interest in doing nothing. They're profiting from the lack of action on climate change. So let's think about the future. This is another famous fellow named Jonas Salk. He's famous these days because he's the inventor of the polio vaccine. Of course, vaccines are on everybody's mind. Well, he asked this question, are we being good ancestors? And it doesn't take much to think about when your progeny will be alive. Your children are likely to live late into this century. Your grandchildren will be alive in the 22nd century, and your great-grandchildren will be alive in the 23rd century. So you can imagine just a couple of generations from now, people will be experiencing either the good or the bad scenarios that we concoct today. So I want to close with this message that there is hope. We do have the technology. And many cities have already established climate action plans. And call your attention to Chicago up here in the upper right. They have their climate action plan was put in place in 2009, more than a decade ago. So we've known what's going on, and we've had the wherewithal to think about it and start to take action. We know how to prepare for the new normal and increase our resilience. We can determine which of our assets are at risk, and we can determine the likelihood of bad events. That's my department. And finally, we can then use those determinations to protect people and the community assets that we value. And I put a little nota bene here. The communities that are least able to adapt are the most at risk, and often those are the same communities that are viewed as in some ways less valuable for whatever reasons. So we have a basic social justice problem associated with protecting the environment. The other part of the problem is not adaptation to the inevitable, but keeping us from getting to the worst case scenario. And we use this term mitigate to do that. And the solution for mitigation is obvious. We have to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane, in the atmosphere. We can do that by doing less emission. We call that conservation. We can reduce our emissions also by doing more alternative energy sources that don't rely on fossil fuel combustion. And finally, we can actually get carbon out of the atmosphere with some technologies that have been developed just in the last decade or so. Here in Virginia, it's a tough row because we have about equally distributed energy consumption from household use, industrial use, transportation, and commercial. So we have to take an all of the above approach. We can't just individually put solar panels on our houses. We have to look at the big picture. And there's a lot of potential economic solutions that we might consider. The harshest one is just regulating by imposing a tax on emitters. This would require setting a cost, sometimes called the social cost of carbon, which is, how much impact are we causing by emitting 1 ton of greenhouse gases. We could also do things that are less draconian and set up markets to allow emitters to trade their permission to emit, and then slowly ratcheting down the amount that we allow over time. And we could also, more recently, we've been seeing companies and individuals using carbon offsets. Many of you may have bought an airplane ticket where you were asked if you wanted to use carbon offsets, and it would elevate the cost of your ticket by a couple of dollars, but it would help offset the amount of fuel that the airplane was using to get you to your destination. So a lot of companies are doing this. These are all companies that have made carbon neutral pledges. JetBlue has already achieved their carbon neutral pledge. They're doing this by purchasing carbon offsets. And whether or not you believe that carbon offsets is a viable strategy, it is what has been employed commercially, at least so far. There's also some innovations that are happening like this one, which I think is very interesting, enhanced geothermal. So many of you have seen that you can get energy by doing geothermal in your household. But as it turns out, we can do geothermal energy if we drill deeper into the ground, things get warmer and we get a bigger advantage thermally by drilling deeper. Well, you're not going to do that in your backyard, but there are companies that have devoted decades to learning how to drill deep. And that's the oil and gas industry. We can give them something to do that they can profit from, which is not digging fossil fuel out of the ground and burning it. We can transform our energy economy to renewable energy like wind power, which we are doing to a small degree so far, solar power. And I don't mean necessarily by having everybody install it on their roof, although that would help, but actually doing this at a commercial scale, large solar farms that we use at the Dominion Power level. I'll skip that for the moment. So here in Virginia, we are taking action. So all the way back in 2008, Governor Kane formed the Climate Change Commission. They made a number of recommendations, which sadly were ignored for 4 years by the following administration. But then in 2015, Governor McAuliffe reinvigorated the Climate Change Commission and began lobbying for legislation to take up their recommendations. And then in 2020, the Virginia legislature changed from Republican control to Democratic control with a Democratic governor. And so the result was 2 big pieces of legislation: the Clean Economy Act, which puts Virginia on a 100% renewable electricity generation trajectory by 2050, and the Virginia Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act, which allows Virginia to join one of these greenhouse gas trading collectives. Fairfax County, the home of George Mason University, has climate action plans for both mitigation, that's the CCAP plan, and for adaptation, which is called Resilient Fairfax. And the same thing is happening in Arlington and Alexandria and other counties, and Manassas is in the process of developing its climate action plan. What else can we do? We can innovate. We can redesign our cities. We have some time, a couple of decades. That's how long it would take to transform our cities to a more climate-friendly design, with permeable pavers to avoid the flash flooding problem, with white roofs and green roofs to help us save on the energy that we're using. We could change our agricultural practices. We can, as I mentioned, go to non-fossil fuel energy generation. We can develop better battery technology so that our energy is usable for more than just the time that we generate it, and so on. And then there was this news item just very recently about carbon capture. This is the world's largest carbon capture plant. It was put up in Iceland. It cost about $15 million to build this plant, and they'll take 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every year. The trouble is, the number is 40 billion, not 4,000. So we need 10 million of these plants if we want to solve the whole problem. So obviously this is not the sole solution. We don't have a few $1 trillion to invest in climate capture stations around the world, but it is a promising technology and it will be part of the solution. So I want to leave you again with the 4 messages from the beginning. These are our takeaway messages. Climate is changing, but the important part is that it's changing so fast. It's changing faster in the past 2 million years. It's hard for us to imagine how we're going to adapt to that. And it's even harder for ecosystems to adapt to it. We're responsible. If we're burning fossil fuel, we're the ones who are causing climate to change. The consequences are serious, and I'm sorry it was a very depressing set of consequences that I described, because the impacts are negative and very costly. But the problem is that we are on a trajectory that, if not regulated, will take us to a very bad place. And finally, there is hope. We have the technology. We know what to do. We just have to do it. And that takes a will, particularly a political will, to make it happen. I'll leave you with this last thought. There are people alive today who include the first generation of people to fully appreciate the potential implications of combusting fossil fuel and changing the CO2 concentrations. This fellow, Suki Manabe, still alive. He's 90 years old. He wrote this paper in 1975, The Effects of Doubling the CO2 Concentration on the Climate. And people alive today also include the last generation who may be able to do what it takes to avoid this trajectory, going to a doubling of emissions before the end of the century and resulting in more than 4 degrees of global warming, or this trajectory, getting us to a carbon neutral world by the end of the century, and possibly even a carbon negative, where we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.
Terrific. I really have never heard a presentation about climate that it was so understandable for us lay people. So thank you very much for that. And by the way, everybody, this was recorded. So you can go to our YouTube channel on Encore Learning and access it. So thank you very much, Jim. This was just great. We do have a few questions. The first one is, it's really more of a comment. Al Gore talked about the situation and its consequences some years ago. Did this information alert society to make changes, or did we just ignore everything that he presented?
Yeah, so this actually came to light at hearings in the Senate in 1988. And again, there are people alive today who were testifying at that Senate meeting. It was convened by Al Gore when he was a senator. The problem has been, and I mentioned this during my lecture, the problem has been that as in all sciences, there is a level of uncertainty. And back in 1988, the level of uncertainty was, reasonably large. And the problem, of course, was not specifically that global warming was uncertain, or even that the magnitude of global warming was uncertain, but the local impacts of global warming were uncertain. And so over that intervening 3 decades or so, we've refined our ability to understand and project what those local impacts are going to be. And, unfortunately, the news is not good. As we've gained confidence, the confidence has been in things that look pretty bad, not in, in that maybe things are okay. So, so that's one side of the thing. The other side of this is that I also mentioned that there are individuals and companies who profit by doing nothing. And it's not a stretch to point out that the oil and gas companies profit by selling oil and gas. And of course, the coal companies profit by selling coal. And it is those three things, combusting coal, combusting petroleum, and combusting natural gas, that are the main contributors to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so I think it was Upton Sinclair who said it's hard to convince a man of something if his paycheck depends on him not believing it. And so we have this situation commercially, and those companies have resisted efforts to put regulations in place or to find solutions. And that's kind of why I mentioned about the oil and gas companies have the technology we might use for enhanced geothermal, because they could be put to work profitably doing something other than extracting coal and natural gas from the earth.
Do you feel that if things get really bad, then some forms of geoengineering will be used despite the risks? And will that kick off a movement?
Yeah, so that's hard to predict. I didn't talk about geoengineering except, in terms of things like geothermal and solar and wind. Geoengineering is it's a broad category. In fact, people in my community don't use that word anymore because it's too broad and it's been kind of misused. But in common parlance, geoengineering refers to intervening in the environment to interrupt that energy disequilibrium I mentioned at the beginning. So one way you might do that is by injecting sulfate aerosols into the high atmosphere, basically like having a volcanic eruption without all the violence at the surface. And that would serve the purpose of increasing the planet's albedo, reducing the amount of energy received from the sun in the first place. But it has a number of unintended consequences, primarily the one relating to ocean acidification. If we keep pumping more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the ocean will keep absorbing part of it. And so that acidification will continue unabated. Another unintended consequence is we don't know what it's going to do to rainfall if we start putting a lot of sulfate into the upper atmosphere. We know that these big volcanic eruptions had the effect of disrupting worldwide rainfall patterns. And so we might do the same thing if we artificially do that. Other things people have suggested is pumping water vapor into the atmosphere to make more low-level clouds, so the clouds will reflect more energy back into space. That also might work. But again, it will have unintended consequences, changing rainfall patterns and also changing humidity, which, as I mentioned, is an issue. So my personal view is that geoengineering is very, very risky, and we really don't understand what the consequences will be, either short-term or long-term. And plus, it's very expensive because it costs, remember, we have to somehow offset 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions, which is a lot, which means putting a lot of sulfate aerosol into the high atmosphere. So you'd have to have fleets of airplanes constantly flying aerosols up into the stratosphere and dumping their load and then coming back and doing it again, basically all the time, very much like a dredging operation that you see in some coastal areas where they have to have the dredges running 24 hours a day just to keep the beach from clogging or the riverway from clogging. So the cost hasn't been estimated very well yet at all. So I can't make a prediction to answer that question, but I think that the negatives at this moment in time, the negatives far outweigh the positives for geoengineering.
Are there certain countries that are acting responsibly in terms of global warming? And as part of that, is China acting responsibly, or are they taking some steps to address the climate situation?
So the humorous story recently was that of all the countries that signed the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, and remember the United States signed it and then withdrew from it for 3 years and then got back in it a few months ago. And that's aligned with the change of administrations. The one country that has actually kept its promise made in Paris was Gambia.
Okay.
So it's a really tiny country and their emissions are really small. It's a poor country. Its economy is not very large. So the fact that they were able to keep their promise is great, but it made practically no difference in the global numbers. The countries in Scandinavia are doing okay. They haven't been completely keeping their promise, but they're on track to get to reaching their promise by 2030, which is good. The United States is not on track to keeping its promise by 2030, but of course there's legislation pending in Congress right now in the big infrastructure bill and in the $3.5 trillion budget bill to get us on that trajectory to keep our promise. China is a kind of a mixed bag because on the one hand, they made a fairly weak promise in Paris. They agreed only to make their emissions of carbon dioxide reach a maximum in 2030, meaning that they would allow it to continue to increase until 2030, and then it would decrease after that. So that's not that hard a promise to keep. They are still building coal-fired power plants in order to build their economy. But at the same time, they lead the world in building solar energy power plants. And they've taken pains to almost corner the market on rare earth minerals that are necessary to build photovoltaic solar panels. So there's a lot of different ways to use the solar energy, but the main one that people think of is what's called photovoltaic, which is, you've seen them, they're like those silverish panels that people put on their roofs. Those are very expensive to make because the minerals that are used to do the photoelectric effect in each panel are these rare earths minerals, and they're only available, they're basically the same as extracting diamonds or other very, very rare things. So China has made deals to get the market on rare earths, and they're building solar panels and batteries with those things. So that's very commendable for them to do that. Some people suspect that there's a strategic plan in place for why corner the market on something that's really going to be very important for the world economy in the future. Well, because you expect to be the only sales source for that, and you can raise the price. But nevertheless, China's, like I said, it's kind of on both sides at this point, and time will tell if they can manage.
Do you ask your students to compute their carbon footprint, and is that knowledge useful to them?
We do. We do have them compute their carbon footprint. Is it useful to them? Well, you'd have to ask them. But the jury's out on whether carbon footprint is a good thing or a bad thing, because on the one hand, carbon footprint simply means you look at all the things you do every day and use online tools to estimate how much carbon is being emitted. So every time you turn on your laptop computer or start your car, how much carbon are you emitting? And then add that up over the whole year, and that's your carbon footprint. For a typical American, it's about 18 tons of carbon dioxide. For a typical citizen of the world, it's more like 5. So Americans are very energy consumptive compared to the typical resident of the Earth. But anyway, the problem with the carbon footprint is two things. One is individuals who make an effort to reduce their carbon footprint are doing a good thing, but they're doing a very small good thing. It's not going to move the needle in the big way that we need. We need to get our emissions down to 0 within just a few decades. And people, recycling and becoming vegetarian and doing other things to lower their carbon footprint is great, but it's not going to move the needle. The other problem with it is it's a psychological problem, which is it gives each of us the impression that we individually are personally responsible for climate change, when in fact we are, but collectively responsible because we're getting our energy from fossil fuel combustion. So if we continue to take personal blame, but don't make the electric power companies change the way they generate energy, then we have no hope of moving the needle. So that it really, what I tell people when they say, what should I do about global warming? I say, get on the phone to your representative in Congress and get your representatives to push incentives for the private sector to get off its fossil fuel addiction. Because only then, if we get power companies and industries that use fossil fuel and cement production, we get them to use alternative sources of energy, and maybe, you know, the transition from coal to natural gas is halfway there, and then another transition to renewables, or maybe carbon offsets in the meantime, while they develop the commercially viable technologies they need to be able to do that. Those are all pathways, but until they've been told they have to get on that pathway, they're not going to do it. So, I recommend collective action rather than individual action.
You have a slide showing that the EU has a downward projection for carbon emissions. Can you say what policies have initiated that and whether it looks sustainable?
Yeah, so the EU is doing better than the United States, but they took global warming seriously much earlier than the United States did. There's been the Green parties are powerful in many of the European countries, and they've been able to push policy agendas that are more eco-friendly, that are more climate change mitigation oriented. So that's why the European trajectory turned down sooner than the United States trajectory did. Is it sustainable? It's a great question. Well, and also, by the way, the Europeans, they've gone to a higher level of nuclear reliance, so nuclear energy generation, which is less of a carbon emitter. It comes with its own risks and issues, of course. And Germany, which was on a big nuclear trajectory kick, has gone away from that after the Fukushima problem in Japan. So there's kind of ups and downs in Europe. The question is it sustainable? That's a great question. I'm not an economist. It's really hard to predict that sort of thing. Germany's getting a new chancellor, so things are changing in Europe in a big way very soon, or maybe not. We'll see. We'll see who gets. I haven't seen who got elected, if that result has been announced yet. But with Angela Merkel leaving, a big proponent for nuclear power and for green policies and with respect to climate changes, she's leaving. It's a real open question who's going to replace her, because Germany more or less leads the European Union.
I don't think there's been a decision on the election yet, as of this morning anyway. So
yeah, I haven't seen it.
Yeah. Is there any work being done to lower emissions on existing cars, SUVs, and trucks, or will everyone have to replace theirs to have a more efficient car or electric?
So the one way to reduce carbon emissions in factories is to put a scrubber that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere on the smokestack. And that's actually a really effective way to reduce carbon emissions from factories. You could employ the same technology on the tailpipe of a car, but it's just too huge, too expensive, too heavy. So it's not really appropriate technology for a mobile system like a vehicle. So the best alternative there is an electric vehicle that has no emissions and gets its electricity from a renewable source. So if you really want to be green with the way you drive, you're going to buy an electric car, and you're going to put solar panels on your house to recharge your vehicle at night, and you're only going to drive 200 miles. So that may not be a solution for everybody. So the solution then is that we have to, like I said before, we have to transform the way we do electric power generation so that it is sustainable and using renewable sources. And then as we transition the fleet of cars over the next decade to 2 decades to electric vehicles, then they'll be drawing their energy from renewable sources, and we won't have a problem. Or at least we won't have a problem with the transportation sector, except for airplanes. So airplanes, nobody's come up with a solar powered airplane that actually hauls any cargo or people. And the only thing I've seen that's promising on that front is what are called renewable biofuels. So it's still a combustion engine in the jet, still producing carbon dioxide, but the carbon dioxide is produced by combusting a renewable biofuel, not a fossil fuel. So that means that it's part of a much shorter timescale cycle of carbon. And when we burn coal, that coal was made 50 million years ago, and it's not going to be replenished for another 50 million years underground. So we've essentially greatly accelerated the carbon cycle when we burn fossil fuel. When we burn biofuel, that gets replenished within a few years. So we haven't really made a huge impact on the carbon dioxide concentrations.
Another question is, what is the reaction of your students to this course? Are they enthusiastic about solving the problems or prone to blame and inertia because of the scale of the challenge and it's is now kicking the can down the road to them?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. And it's kind of hard to answer in one sentence. And so we have some students who are taking a course because it satisfies the natural science requirements. So they get a certain number of credits that they can put on their transcript that they can check the box that says, I took a science course. And those people don't really care one way or the other about climate change. I don't think. But I think the majority of the students who take our class are concerned. And that number, that ratio of people who are taking it because they need to and people who are taking it because they want to, that's been shifting to the want to side over the years. And that's because it's becoming a more and more, it's on everybody's lips now. Climate change, what do we do about it? How can we solve this problem? So I think in general, the students we're seeing are responding positively. It is a really depressing course. It's very much structured the way the lecture was, where we give them the basics of climate science. We talk about what's changing. We talk about what the impacts and consequences of those changes are. And that part is a really depressing part of the course. We're coming into that right now this semester. So I'm kind of, girding myself for a lot of crying students. And then the last couple of weeks of the semester, we talk about solutions, and the "there is hope" message comes through. We have the students debate among themselves about, what are the best solutions and why is there all this political inertia to get moving in the United States. So they get familiar with some of these political overtones and also the economics of climate change. And I think it's generally well received. I mean, our reviews are all very good. We review better than all the courses in the College of Science, for that matter. So that's great. But as far as whether they're actually changing their lives, I can't tell you that. I have no idea.
Thank you. What is your stance on a carbon tax?
So I view the carbon tax as, you might call it the nuclear option, is just because it's kind of big and draconian. And there are people who believe that a carbon tax is inevitable because incentive programs are only going to push people so far, and there's ways around. And there's, for example, the carbon offset program is there's some shaky bits of that. The basic idea is that you pay money to protect a rainforest somewhere in, say, Indonesia. And there's a private company that monitors whether or not those rainforests are actually getting cut down or not. So, potential for corruption is there. So we'll see if carbon offsets continues to be a way forward. But generally, the market has been a viable way to go. It didn't work so well in Europe until they recalibrated it. The way they were calculating cost was not efficient, wasn't working, it wasn't giving anybody any incentives. But now it's working better. There are regional carbon trading markets, like the one that Virginia has just joined. It's called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That allows companies in Virginia to trade emission allowances with other companies in New England and the Northeastern US. So there's the potential there that the market forces will help incentivize both innovation and compliance, and we won't have to go to a carbon tax. But at the end of the day, it may be that incentives and markets don't do enough fast enough, and we will have to impose a carbon tax. And this is actually being debated right now in the US Congress. The question has arisen. They're trying to work through the budget bill and some of the provisions for very aggressive action to incentivize carbon neutrality are getting, they're not as popular with enough votes in the Senate to actually pass. And so they're more watered down. And in order to achieve the goal, they may have to add a carbon tax, which would basically be a penalty paid by carbon emitters. And it would only be the large, companies. It would be individuals. But you'll feel it. I mean, consumers will feel it when those companies pass the cost along to consumers. So it's painful, and it's not. I view it as kind of the ultimate option that should only be explored after we've got we haven't had enough success with other options.
I have three more questions. We're getting towards the end, but if everybody could just hang in there, Jim, you're just doing such a great job. So many of our cities are on water. New York is on water. Miami, you said, could be underwater. New Orleans is perpetually underwater. So is it time to relocate some cities and get them out of the danger zone, so to speak? I mean, New Orleans, will it ever not be in a dire situation?
So New Orleans is below sea level currently. It was below sea level when Katrina hit in 2005. And it survives with the protection of a levee system that holds the water back. And after Katrina, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers spent $16 billion to update and modernize the levee system around New Orleans. As we saw during Hurricane Ida, it worked for those parts of New Orleans that are protected. But there are plenty of parishes in Louisiana, just slightly outside of the city limits of New Orleans, that were outside of the new levee system, and they were swamped. So, a city like Houma, or Homa, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, in Louisiana, is in desperate straits right now as a result of Hurricane Ida. They weren't protected. So that's kind of the trade-off. If you want to protect Norfolk and Hampton Roads and the Tidewater region of Virginia, if you want to protect Manhattan, particularly lower Manhattan, because it's lower, as it turns out, it's not just south, it's actually lower. Staten Island, Hoboken, Baltimore, Alexandria, several cities that are on the coast in the Carolinas, Charleston, for example. Those cities would have to be protected with similar order of magnitude types of infrastructure. Very much the way the Netherlands has done is the Netherlands is also below sea level and has been for centuries. And they protected themselves with a series of dikes, and they modernize those dikes every few decades so that they're very sophisticated now. They're dynamic and they respond to events. The same thing would have to happen, and so was New Orleans' new system. So the same thing would have to happen in Miami and all these other cities that are on the coast. So that's the trade-off. Do you abandon the city and move everything 500 miles inland, or do you build the protections that you need? And it'll come down to this point I made in the lecture, which is there are communities we value, and there are communities that have less value to our society. And you can see it on the ground in Louisiana. You can see what they chose to protect. They chose to protect the tourist area of Bourbon Street because tourist dollars flowing into Louisiana are a big part of their economy. They chose to protect the port facilities because the port facility with tankers flowing up and down the Mississippi is a big part of their economy. They chose not to protect the rural parishes that are much more expensive to protect, but also fewer people and fewer economic value. They made those decisions, whether anybody likes it or not. Those decisions were made. And we have to make the same kinds of decisions. Do we protect Norfolk? And a lot of the property that's right on the water in Norfolk is either military, because the Norfolk Naval Base is there, or it's low-income housing. So again, are we going to protect those communities that are most vulnerable and potentially of least value to us? Because that's, that's why I said it's a social justice issue, and it's quite an important factor in climate change.
Yeah, I hope we protect Alexandria. That's where I live, so that's high on the list.
You've been seeing it, right? I mean, you see,
right, exactly.
When it's particular tide and the moon is full, and it's that time of the month. You're seeing the water coming up over the banks, and it doesn't have to be a rainy day. No, so you are seeing it.
Okay, let me ask the two last questions because I want everybody to have in on this. I've heard discussed one possible solution to global warming that might avoid the kinds of sacrifices that put people off. It would be to blast into Earth's orbit large volumes of reflective particles to reflect sunlight away from the Earth, sort of your own massive volcano eruption. And maybe you had talked about that earlier. Obviously, you could overdo it and overly cool the Earth, but and hence rinsing. But we could get to the 4 degrees. It could. But if we got to +4 degrees, it might be worth looking into. And you had talked about that, right?
Yeah. So there's so this idea is that it's a parasol idea. Just like you put up an umbrella when it's hot and sunny to protect yourself, you can do the same thing for the whole planet. There's a couple of ways that people are talking about doing it. The one I mentioned is small particles, sulfate aerosols that we inject into the high atmosphere. But what the questioner is asking about is mirrors in space. So that's another way where we fabricate tiny mirrors and we put them in orbit. So they stay up there essentially as long as they can stay up in orbit until their orbit decays. The problem with that one is that unless they're dynamic, unless we have some way of controlling those mirrors, so get them up and get them down or make them turn or what have you, then we're running the risk of making really big changes that we can't reverse. And that's the unintended consequences of that could be quite bad. And so from my point of view, that one's a bit out there, literally, because it's in outer space, but also a little bit intellectually, it's a bit out there, and it's going to be very hard to test. It's a lot of these things have to be tested quite a lot, and we don't have a laboratory the size of Earth over here that we can test things in that won't hurt people. So part of geoengineering, the problem is we don't have a lab where we can do things safely. We're all guinea pigs for any geoengineering experiment.
The last question here is, how big a factor is the growth of human population? How significant is that to the production of carbon dioxide? How closely are they related? How big a deal is it, this population growth?
Yeah, so it's a very big deal, because basically I showed you the numbers. The population is growing exponentially. We've more than doubled in my lifetime, and we've grown by 50% just in the last 30 years globally in terms of population. And each and every person is a consumer. Now, some people, like Americans, are much bigger consumers than other people, like Gambians, but still, the number of people on the planet all consuming energy increases the energy production that we have to do to meet that demand. And what's more, many developing countries, notably China and India, which have large populations, who don't have electric power, who don't have air conditioning, obviously, who don't have automobiles of their own, they don't eat meat. They want all of those things. They see those as elevating their standard of living. And in order to deliver those things, their per capita consumption of energy has to go up. So as population grows, and almost as importantly, as the standard of living goes up in developing countries, both of those have an enormous impact on carbon dioxide emissions.
Well, we've gone over a little bit on the talk, but clearly everybody has a lot of interest in what you're saying. And again, I really can't thank you enough for making it so user-friendly for those of us that are not in your business, Jim. So thank you.